All right, thank you everybody for being here. I'm Jeremy Fricke. I'm the new executive director of NACO Heritage Alliance. I started just a few months ago and looking forward to this program. This is logging ranching in the military African Americans of the Grand Canyon region with Margaret, who is a wonderful person if you haven't met. But if this is your first time, I think you'll learn that very quickly. Just so you know, NACO Heritage Alliance is an organization in Cochise County, located with Bisbee and NACO. And we do a variety of programming on Borderlands arts, history, and culture, especially on the Buffalo Soldiers. And we are the caretakers of Camp NACO, a Buffalo Soldier site in near the border. But with that, I do want to kind of give my time, if you will, to Margaret so that she can introduce herself how she would like to. She said she has a lot of slides for you. So,
I do. And I've hopefully I'm not I can't see you all. So I do have quite a few. I'm gonna chitty chat. I recommend it put some questions in the comment section or speak up if you have a quick question because I can't see everybody. So just to start off with, I actually literally tripped into this topic. For those who don't know me, I was the forest archaeologist in the Kaibab National Forest for 15 years prior to transferring down to the Tonto. So I one day got a call from the Grand Canyon. They often frequently called me up and asked me for stuff. And one day I got a call and they said, well, would you be willing to do a presentation on Black history? By the way, the call came in November. The presentation was in February, and I said, "Oh, sure." And they wanted something specific to the Grand Canyon, and I said, "Sure." I had no idea what I was going to say, but I agreed to do it. And next thing you know, had a presentation and have been going ever since. So, well, this presentation is kind of what I discovered, but it's also really looking at the larger picture in terms of the Grand Canyon and Black history. But before you can even talk about Black history in the Southwest, you absolutely have to acknowledge the fact that people of African descent have been in the Southwest. They basically landed here with the Spanish and the Portuguese. A lot of folks, when they think of African Americans, they start thinking about the 1619 Project and Hannah Nicole Jones's recent work talking about African American slaves being sold to the English by the Dutch on the East Coast. And so people just assume that's the start of Black history in the United States, when in fact, actually, Africans and African descended people have been here since Columbus. And some people think even earlier, but I'm not going there. The point being is that Spain and Portugal had a long history with northern and western Africa long before this continent, before they landed on this continent. I don't want to say they discovered this continent because there were clearly already people here. But the point is when they came, they brought people of African descent with them. So there were people of African descent on their boats. There were people who they brought with them, and quickly they ended up importing African slaves to was by that point, we're sitting in Arizona. At one point, this was part of Mexico or Spanish land, Spanish managed land, and then later Mexico. So these African descended people were being imported by the Spanish and later by Mexico. Now, interestingly enough, Mexico abolishes slavery because there was slavery in Mexico, but Mexico abolishes slavery in 1829. So there were people of African descent all over the area of the lands that Mexico managed, which includes much of Arizona and California. So there were certainly people of African descent in Tucson and San Diego and Los Angeles, all throughout the Southwest. Well before America landed into or started taking over this territory. So recognize that there's been a long history of African descended people in the Southwest. So just to highlight that, so there are some well-known Spanish Africans, some certainly a lot more than we know from the history books, but some of the most well-known certainly is Esteban, who was thought to have been asked to, he was part of a large party that moved out from Mexico north into the Southwest Arizona area, looking for the Cibola, the city, seven cities of gold. He was known by, he apparently made it as far north as what is today Hopi. Line is Spanish. There was a long history of people of African descent who were also either mestizos mixed with Spanish or Mexican blood or Indian blood. And in some cases, these were leaders. So one of the last governors of California, before California became an American state, was actually a Black descended person. And I saw a great presentation last night from a woman out of University of Ohio who's doing her work about escaped slaves into Mexico. And she pointed out that some of the early Mexican presidentes were actually of African descent. So there's been this long history of Africans and African descended people throughout the Southwest. And of course, now you know how it is. Nothing wants to advance when you want it to advance. Let's see if I can get it down here. Ah, so just to give you a context of history, of course, we have the Mexican-American War, which ends in 1846, and then the Gadsden Purchase in 1850. So meanwhile, the state of California becomes a state in 1850, of course. So as America starts expanding west, with it, of course, come African Americans, African people of African descent, both free and enslaved people who do make their way out to the Southwest. These are just examples of folks that I could happen to find photos of. There were way more than I think history books have ever recorded, but these are some of the most known. James P. Beckworth, he was a mountain man. He actually guided military forays. He was a man of all trades, certainly spent time with a lot of the tribal communities out west. He actually wrote a book about his life. He is, and this is the same James P. Beckworth. There is a town in California named after him, Beckworth. There is actually a pass in the Sierra Nevadas named after him. Other people of African descent who made their way west, and a lot of people don't know this, but the Mormon community, as they moved out of Nauvoo into what is now Utah, many of their members were actually Southerners. They were slaveholders. So they actually, their slaves were being brought out to the territories by Mormons and converted Mormons. So there were, in fact, enslaved people in what is now today Salt Lake City, and there were people who were not only brought there, but they were bought and sold there. Other people of African descent or slaves were brought with Southerners as Southerners made their way out to California before California became a state. Remember, each state, when it became recognized by the Union, the big discussion was, would it become a slave state or a free state? California came into the Union as a free state. However, prior to becoming a free state, gold was discovered in Sierra Nevadas, and Southerners were making their way to the Sierra Nevadas and taking their slaves with them to work the gold fields. So up until California comes into the Union as a free state, there were enslaved people in California. However, there are also enslaved people who were taken to California after it became a state. The woman on the left is Biddy Mason, and she is probably one of the most known. She wasn't the only, but she was enslaved to a Mormon man who had a ranch in San Bernardino, California. San Bernardino, California was a Mormon community. Still, it's quite a few Mormons who are still there, but it was established by Mormons. She and 3 other people were enslaved by him. They were brought to California. They sued for their freedom. She got her freedom. She became quite an entrepreneur. She bought up land in what is now Los Angeles, helped start the Black AME Church in Los Angeles, and did a lot of very good work in Los Angeles. So she did quite a bit, but she was not the only one, but she's who we know. And then Amanda and Samuel, of course, were Mormons who came into the Mormon Church after the Civil War. But when you think of Utah Mormons, you don't think of Black people, but there has actually always been Black people associated with the Mormon Church, although not in large numbers. Let's see if I can get this. So the Civil War in 1865, and I want to point out, this is really critical for the Black experience in the West. because we go through the Civil War, which most of us know was not really fought out west, although we had a couple of battles in Picacho Peak. Soon after the Civil War, you had, especially after Reconstruction, right about the 1870s, you had the installation of what they call the Jim Crow laws or black codes. So throughout the South, even though Black people were freed, more and more laws and policies were put in place to try to control the Black population of the South, and much of it leading to a lot of violence. So for Black people in the South, most folks know, I don't need to tell you about Civil War, but you got to recognize there's a lot of violence. And in some cases, I just happened to be in Louisiana just a few weeks ago. In some cases, some of these codes you actually allowed, and there were Black codes in New Orleans, which actually allowed white men to physically beat up a Black person who did not cross the street when they walked down the street. They actually had the legal right to do that. So I bring that up because I want to compare it to the life out west. These codes were primarily in southern states. It's not to say that we didn't have segregation out west. We absolutely did have segregation out west. And I'll talk about one of the main areas and where that was really installed legally. But for a Black person making their way out west, it wasn't in race and codes. It was mainly in a systemic racism. So it was really a social, and through social is how that was informed. And for those of us with a certain age, I always point out this is why you have a Hanna-Barbera cartoon sitting there, because I think it's a really good example and explains how it's different out west than it was in the South. And this could actually be applied to the North as well, North and Mason-Dixon line. Black people and people of color were accepted so long as they stayed within certain social norms. So that cartoon is a really good example in that it says, here's this elf who really wants to be a dentist, but he keeps being denied that because he's being told he's an elf. And elves only can do one thing. They can make toys. So Black people and people of color were accepted so long as they stayed in their lane, essentially. And these codes were certainly enforced through social norms, but also through media. For instance, these two cartoons, I took these straight out of the newspaper in Williams, where you had major stories, often novellas and things that were put in major newspapers across the U.S. And they had they had stories, and in some ways tacitly enforced some of this segregation. So although there were no laws in place for the most part, it still was enforced through social norms. So that major, so to explain the major difference between how the Black experience in the West and the Black experience in the South. So back into Arizona, I want to point out a couple things, and I'm going to go through and look at how we see this major changes in population in Arizona through time. And it's because of the migration of Black people. And you can really see it in our census. And I especially want to point out that 1860 number. Now, I already pointed out that prior to the Gadsden Purchase, we had a lot of African descended people who are mixed race or African descended people in Arizona, particularly in Tucson and Southern Arizona, California, and so in other communities. So there were African descended people in Arizona in 1860 who were probably mixed race Mexican. Notice it says 21 Black people. Notice it also says all free. So two key things I point out here. They're not enumerating a mixed race Mexican Black people in the census. They're not being enumerated. They're essentially erased when America takes over this territory. That, it turns out, I learned last night, was true for Mexico as well. Early Mexico census did not enumerate people of African descent, did not identify that. So that apparently was something that was commonly done until recently in Mexico. The other thing I want to point out is it says 21 free people. This is before the Civil War. This is a territory. Arizona and New Mexico are territories. They are not states. So there could very well have been people, enslaved people in this state. That's more research to be done, but it's something to consider because this is before emancipation. Anyway, as you can see, by 1890, there is a significant increase. And I would say, actually, and I'm sure John Langolier would agree with me, it really starts in the early 1880s. And I'm going to top into why that is. And just to keep, before I do, a couple of things I want to point out is that as exploratory and as people start moving into this territory, more and more Black people are coming in with them in a variety of ways. Of course, we have the railroad coming in northern Arizona in the early 1881. There's major expeditions coming out of Washington, D.C. to explore the Colorado River. And gee, who do they have that they might be able to grab as labor to hang out on a river in a boat for months? I don't know, maybe Black people in Washington, D.C. So there are Black people who are making their way out for a variety and through a variety of different avenues out towards the western part and certainly the Grand Canyon area. The other thing I want to point out is the Colorado River, prior to it being dammed, and before the railroad was established in 1881, the way to get goods and services into the interior of Arizona was up the Colorado River. And so there were Black people who were coming in actually working on those boats up the Colorado River. The other thing that was bringing Black people out west, certainly after the Civil War, was the Homesteading Act, the 1862 Homesteading Act. Many Black people took advantage of this opportunity. One of the things that was unique about the 1862 Homesteading Act is that, in fact, it was, in a sense, colorblind. You set your you found your land, you registered it, you proved it up, you got that land. That was not the truth. That was not the case for homesteading acts in the South. But out west, the 1862 Homesteading Act was, and many Black people utilized that as a way to get land, also to create communities. So some of the most known, of course, is there were freedom towns in Oklahoma. There was a community called Blackdom in New Mexico, Mobile in Arizona, Randolph in Arizona, Allensworth in California, Nicodemus in Kansas, which is one of the earliest. So the Homesteading Act was a way for people to get some agency and actually acquire land. Okay, I did want to touch on mining. Most of what I know about Black people mining is actually southern Arizona, so the Superior area and the copper mines of the southern Arizona. But I can tell you that there were folks who were Black people who were mining in northern Arizona. Northern Arizona had copper mines. In fact, one of the highest producing copper mines, the Anita mine, was located south of the Grand Canyon. For about 3 years, it was the highest producing copper mine in the state. So I can tell you that there were Black people who were a part of mining. Probably the most known is the work that's been done by Mr. Bernard Wilson out of Tucson, who did a lot of work in the Superior area and looked at those areas. But I can tell you this is something that you can see across the state where Black people are being hired as labor or themselves prospecting mines. Ranching and cowboys. Most people know Black cowboys. Certainly after the Civil War, you do see Black men who were trained with cattle and horses who are going in the private side of it, who are becoming ranchers or themselves cowboys. For those who are not familiar with this, the term cowboy is actually a derogatory term. It was a term that was applied to Black men who worked cattle and cows, aka cow boy. White Hispanic men were known as vaqueros. White men, now cowboys, were buckaroos, and they had other terms. The term cowboy became popular because of Hollywood. So that's what we were raised with, but in fact, it is a derogatory term. Black men certainly were hired out on ranches. Not as many Black cowboys in northern Arizona, This is Jeff Tribbett. He is one of the few that I've come across. I think they were here. There were probably a few more than we know about. Certainly, definitely in southern Arizona. But in northern Arizona is not as many. Jeff Tribbett with Jeff, it's pretty interesting because he actually was born enslaved to the Greer family, who was a Mormon family in Texas. And they actually moved out of Texas to northern Arizona. Certainly, you may be familiar with Greer Valley outside of the White Mountain. St. John, St. Joseph areas, that area. Their family came in 1879 and brought Jeff with them. He was born enslaved to them, but I think was raised with the boys and was almost like a member of the family when they moved their cattle up to that area. He later moved to California and actually died in California. But he's one of the few examples. But we do know that there are other Black men here, and one of the areas that Black men also were accepted in terms of labor were as cooks. So not only as cowboys, but as cooks for some of the big ranching outfits. I'm just having all sorts of technology issues. All right. Oh, dear. Okay. Can you guys still see what I'm sharing? Thank you.
Yep.
So the Atchison Topeka Santa Fe Railroad, actually the first railroad that came through northern Arizona was actually built by the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad Company. They built it out of Albuquerque to California. Then it was later purchased by the Atchison Topeka and Santa Fe. This opened up northern Arizona to lumber, the lumber industry. It also opened up northern Arizona to ranching and other extractive industries. Mining was already here. Certainly Mingus Mountain, Jerome in that area actually already was in full force. So copper mining was in full force, but when the railroad came in, it offered a way for them to get their resources out and back in, but also opened the area up to lumber and ranching. So certainly a lot of people of color, and only just African Americans. This is a dam that's just outside of Walnut. It's in the Walnut Canyon area, just outside of Flagstaff. And you can see there's a mix of all sorts of folks of different shades and colors in that photo. This actually came to light through the National Park Service. But it tells you there were a lot of people of color who were making their way in northern Arizona. And when the railroad came through, that certainly opened up the area. So, and I'm sure John is good to see this. So by the early 1880s, and thank you, John, for those who didn't get a chance to hear John's Langelier's presentation the other day through the Arizona Preservation Foundation, but he's got another one coming up. I highly recommend it. He pointed out that the Buffalo Soldiers earliest arrived in Arizona in the 1880s. So most of those of us with Camp Naco certainly are very familiar with Buffalo Soldiers on the U.S.-Mexican border. Absolutely. But not everybody is aware of the fact that some of their first forays into the state was actually northern Arizona. Certainly when the railroad came in, it was say early 1880s, the railroad came through in 1881. They were stationed both at Fort Whipple and at Fort Verde in the Verde Valley. And for those who aren't familiar, Fort Whipple is in Prescott. And they did various stints in and out of, and I'll leave that to John to talk about in more detail. But the key points here I wanted to point out for those who are not familiar with the Buffalo Soldiers and their history. This is a peacetime military that evolves out of the Civil War Black troops. One of the key, especially for the overall West, they made up a huge part of the military in the West, actually throughout the U.S., but especially in the U.S. and the West where it was developing. So literally 1/5 of the total military, and John will probably correct me later on, but that my point here is that they're all over the Western U.S. and so there are major presence here, and certainly in northern Arizona and then later in southern Arizona. And stationed, of course, in all of the major ports, They were essentially here to help keep the peace. They certainly were used for the Apache Wars, and also especially northern Arizona, to ensure that tribal people remained on the reservations that had already been established by that point. And certainly making sure that, you know, Mr. Coppermine owner who has a lot of money gets his money up to the railroad without any problems. So they were used in a variety of different capacities, but they absolutely were a presence here in northern Arizona as well. So other ways that African Americans made their way to the north, and certainly the south, is through the service industry. I point this out because this is often talked about, this woman who was a domestic who comes to Phoenix as a domestic with a family out of Arkansas. But if you've been listening to me, you realize that there were Black people, a lot of Black people here long before he came to Phoenix. But absolutely, service industries would have been a way that Black people would have made their way up to northern Arizona, and certainly would have survived in northern Arizona. And all of Arizona, women, African American women, were certainly making their way out west, sometimes as part of families or as single women. They were certainly working as domestics and cooks. That central photo, by the way, that is actually Fort Verde. In Verde, and apparently that couple worked for the fort. But as most women who make their way in the West, there aren't a whole lot of economic opportunities. So, you know, domestics, laundries, prostitution, cooks are some of the opportunities. A lot of in some cases, and certainly here in Williams, some of these women became landowners. They used the 1862 Homesteading Act and actually earned their own land and became economically independent. One of the ways you do see major segregation, and it is certainly supported by law in Arizona, is school segregation. Our Arizona school system was segregated in 1909. And note that that's before Arizona becomes a state. There's a lot of Southerners who are traveling at this time. So and I show the example of these two schools. That is absolutely the school, a school class photo in Williams, Arizona in 1900. That certainly is a mixed race of kids. Though on the left, that is, the Dunbar School is actually Dunbar School. That would have been in Flagstaff. Flagstaff had a large enough population. Any community that had a large enough population of Black students, they actually did create separate Black schools. But in communities like Williams, which had Black students, but not a lot of Black students, oftentimes they either gave them their separate desk in the same room with some sort of barrier, or in the case of Williams, where they segregated not only Black students, but Hispanic students, they actually taught them in the basement. So in fact, there are people who are still living in Williams who remember that, when the Hispanic students were actually segregated in the basement of the schools. So Arizona's population, as you can see, certainly it stays fairly steady, and by 1920s, between 1920 and 1930 on, you see this major jump in Arizona's Black population, and that absolutely is due to northern Arizona. One of the key things that is happening, as I said, because of the racism and the violence that's happening due to Jim Crow in the South, there is a major diaspora. Most people are familiar with the diaspora out of the South to the north, to the northern cities where they've got major manufacturing jobs. So you see Black people who are coming from agricultural jobs, usually farmers, sharecroppers, who are leaving. They're going north and into major industries in the north. Blacks are as familiar with the fact that you also see a major migration out of the South to the West. And there's a variety of things that are pushing this, and I'm going to talk why this is key for northern Arizona. But as you can see, and I love this map because it shows them going to Phoenix, which actually is probably true right about in the 1950s. But the major movement of African Americans out of the South to northern Arizona actually was triggered right about the 1920s. And it is a significant migration. And that's due to the lumber industry. The lumber industry of the South, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, major lumber companies out of the Northeast moved into the South. The South's major economic driver was not lumber. It was cotton, it was rice, it was indigo, it was other crops. They were not wholeheartedly harvesting the lumber resources of the South. So after the Civil War, the South was devastated economically. So all these companies out of the Northeast of states moved out of the Northeast states, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. They moved to the South and started lumber companies in the South, starting in the late 1860s, early 1870s. Massive lumber companies throughout the southern states, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, West Virginia, all of those states are full of trees, and they absolutely exploited those trees. By the 1920s, they had overexploited it to the point where some of these companies were struggling to survive. One of them was the Katy Company out of Katy, Louisiana. They recognized they could no longer survive. So they literally closed the doors on their town and their business, and lock, stock, and barrel took all 500 of their employees, many of which were Black. Now recognize who's the biggest labor source after Civil War. Yes, Black people. A good chunk of the labor in these big timber industry, in these big timber towns, were Black people. But of course, being the South, they're segregated mill towns, but a good chunk of their labor are Black people. So the Katy Company literally picks up and moves to northern Arizona. They basically take over a town called Cooley on the White Mountain Apache Reservation and land there about 1924. So they land, basically they purchase a mill operation that had not survived on the White Mountain Apache Reservation. This was lumber that had been sold by the BIA to investors. The investors didn't make it. They mothballed their operations. Katy Company walked in, purchased the whole thing, and started up the next day. They brought with them their Black employees. They created a segregated community on the White Mountain Apache Reservation. And if you look in the 1930 census, you can absolutely see it. Also, if I've recently got my hands on aerials of this community. Unfortunately, they're too big for me to look at, but you can absolutely see where it's segregated. They have a segregated, what they call the Black Quarter, which is that photo that you see below there. Probably several hundred people live there. They had the White Town, which is basically what McNary is today. So the town exists today, and what exists is essentially what the White Town was. They had a Hispanic quarter, which was, by the way, next door to the Negro quarter, and they had what was known as the Indian Crib, according to the census. I have yet to figure that one out, and I'm not sure if these are Apache employees or who, but they are certainly Indian employees, all living and supporting this lumber operation. I want to point out that Katy was not the only one. Actually, a lot of these companies left the South and made their way out west. And Katy wasn't the first. Actually, the Hutchinson Lumber Company out of West Virginia, interestingly enough, made their way out to the Sierra Nevadas in 1920, and then another Powell Lumber Company made their way north of Reno in 1926, north of Oroville in 1926, which is the reason why Oroville, by the way, has a Black historical society. Yes, there's still a remnant Black community in Oroville, and it's all part of this migration. So as I pointed out, there was the migration out of the South into the North. So you're going from agriculture into industry. The timber migration is really unique. The lumber migration is because literally these are skilled lumber workers who are coming out of the South, a lumber industry, coming to the West, not only to Arizona, but they're making their way to California, the Sierra Nevadas. They're making their way to Oregon. They're making their way to Washington State. Anywhere where there is a lumber industry, these Black skilled lumber workers are making their way out of the South and into these industries. And so you see this movement of not only migrant lumber workers, but people are actually coming and staying in the communities as well. So in northern Arizona, once Katy lands in the 1920s, you see the migration, and then more and more lumber mills start popping up in places like Holbrook, Winslow, Flagstaff. It already was part of the lumber industry, and sure enough, some of the early lumber companies were hiring Black people already. Williams, with the Saginaw Manistee, originally did not hire Black people. They're out of the Midwest. They chose not to, but they left in the 1950s. New mills came into Williams, and sure enough, that brought with them Black mill workers into Williams. And also Peach Springs on the Havasupai Reservation. Actually, there was a mill there. There's some of the families who are in Williams actually landed in Peach Springs first. So all of these small lumber related companies in northern Arizona all were full of Black skilled lumber workers and those who came with them, families, wives, families, and other support systems as part of these communities. They all had Black churches. In fact, there are Black churches in these communities that still exist. So there are still remnant populations left over from this migration of Black people to the northern Arizona lumber community. One thing to keep in mind is that the timber industry in northern Arizona starts dying in the 1960s into the 1980s. So many of these people who were here left. So folks, because there wasn't a lot of opportunity, you see a lot of these folks did leave and go to other opportunities. So you have folks in Phoenix, Tucson, and other places who actually grew up in northern Arizona and have moved into other opportunities. So although there are small remnants of these populations and absolutely active churches, the Galilee Church in Williams has 30 members. It was established in 1949, and there's still families here, but they came because of the logging and stayed basically. And so that speaks to a little bit to what I was just trying to say, in that part of the biggest concerns that we have, especially those who are interested in the history of northern Arizona, is simply that because so many of those people left, there's very few here to fight to remind people of this history. And as a result, there are situations in which some of this history is actually kind of not intentionally, but certainly is being erased. And one case in point, of course, is northern Arizona's own lumberjack, and who is their key mascot is this burly lumberjack, part of NAU's mascot, which is interesting because a huge chunk of the lumber workers, including around Flagstaff, were in fact Black. So, there's been a resurgence of recognition that there's a problem here. So that's some of the things that we're trying to erase or trying to address, is the fact that this history is leaving simply because there are very few people left to tell this history and to continue to keep this history. So, couple of the point on, one of the key things about coming into northern Arizona, obviously, is the fact that people, as they made their way towards Arizona, there is an issue, and that is traveling. Prior to the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, traveling while Black certainly had a lot of challenges. And there were a lot of challenges for Black people who made their way across the state, and certainly out of the South into the state. Some who actually had income certainly could drive. Others came by railroad. But for folks who were facing southern facing poverty and or violence in the South, moving out of the South into the lumber industry of the North certainly was um, a good option for Black people, especially highly skilled Black people. And I love this statement here from this gentleman out of Mississippi, where he says, well, you had to, you either were gonna stay at home in Mississippi and get lynched, or you come up west and it's true, you get paid the same amount as a white man. These men did in fact get paid per day the same as much per day in Arizona as it would have been a week in Mississippi. So certainly the move gave these folks a lot more opportunity. And one of the ways they absolutely did make their way, if they made their way on whether Route 66 or came along 60 or 80, they certainly used, most people are familiar with the Green Book. This was created in the 30s. It absolutely did enumerate major routes in Arizona. And a lot of this allowed Black people to be able to know if they're going to a new place that they've never been to. They would tell them places where they could absolutely get served, gas stations where they could buy gas, restaurants where they could actually get food, grocery stores, and places that they could actually get housing. So this was critical. Green Book is the most famous, but it wasn't the only one. So there were other books that were developed and oftentimes sold by, I believe it's Esso gas stations, which did all of which did actually sell gas to Black people, and I believe they sold these, and other places in which they were available for Black travelers. Something else to think about in terms of Arizona and traveling, and which is a unique aspect of Arizona, is the Fred Harvey Company and the Harvey houses. Whether you were driving or whether you were on railroad, Harvey houses and Fred Harvey had the contract for building the commissaries and houses along the major railroads of Atchison, Topeka, as well as the contract in the Grand Canyon and several of the national parks. They actually, as part of their policy, served anyone, including Black people. So a Black person on the railroad, once they got past Mississippi, could get served and get service in a Harvey house. That is also true for the Grand Canyon. People could, in fact, visit the Grand Canyon and get served in services there. He also hired Black people. In fact, my understanding is that the Harvey houses, when they first opened, hired Black waiters. And Kathy's nodding her head. She knows this. They hired Black waiters. But many Southerners who were traveling at the time object to Black waiters. So that's where the Harvey girls came in. So that became the response to that complaint. However, it doesn't mean that they absolutely got rid of all their Black waiters. This is the Escalante in Ash Fork staff, and their 1930 census, I believe, actually lists a Black waiter. And if you can look up here, if you can see there is a dapper looking man with a great hat and a nice tie. And I suspect he was the Black waiter that they enumerated in the 1930 census when they walked through the Escalante and enumerated the people who were working there. They also noticed they also hired Chinese, Japanese, it hired Native Americans. He employed a lot of people of color. This, by the way, that's George Suzuki. He is actually buried in the cemetery in Ash Fork. And that is his name in Chinese written on the side of that. That's a photo that came in from a collection we have here in Williams. Anyway, the point is that, yes, so the Harvey houses were certainly something that Black people could rely on when they traveled. Another bit of Black history in Northern Arizona that, in fact, across Arizona, I wanted to point out as I start to wind up. A lot of people are familiar with the CCC program, the Civilian Conservation Corps program, which was prevalent across the entire state. Certainly these camps, these are young men, usually between the ages of 18 and 25. This is a program that was one of many programs as part of the Works Projects programs implemented by Roosevelt. This in particular one was bringing in young men to do a lot of labor, a lot of, and oftentimes frequently used with national parks and in cities to develop roads, trails, and other sorts of recreation opportunities and other sites, to other types of other programs. I'm pointing this one out because of the fact that a lot of people don't know, but the CCC program between 1933, when it was established, in 1935 was an integrated program. So Civilian Conservation Corps camps that were established prior to 35 actually were mixed race. And that's true in the Grand Canyon. So the Grand Canyon camp, which was down in Indian Springs, is that right? They actually had Black enrollees. In 35, the program was segregated and there was never Black enrollees again after 35 in the Grand Canyon. But these are actually photos that were done by Bob Aldrich, who wrote the book on Civilian Conservation Corps in the Grand Canyon. And he brought these photos to me. So what I since have found out that there were camps on the Tonto National Forest that predate 1935 that actually had Black enrollees also. More research to be done, but that is another aspect of Black history in the state that not everybody is aware of. Lastly, I want to point out another aspect of Black history, Arizona, certainly northern Arizona, is Black tourism. A lot of people don't think of Black people as being tourists, certainly before the Civil Rights Act, but Black people were absolutely tourists. Black people had cars, and thanks to the Green Book, places like Bisbee, if you notice, it's there. Douglas, certainly Douglas and Bisbee, Nogales, they make it early and the early versions of the Green Book. But places like Flagstaff, Grand Canyon, Kingman, Route 66 places, they don't make it onto the Green Book until the early 50s. So this particular photo is of tourists in front of Bright Angel, taken in 1956 by one of the Cole brothers. So Black people were absolutely making their way to national parks and doing tours just like anybody else at that time. All right, so I just want to wrap up a little bit by saying that, especially in northern Arizona and across Arizona, but especially northern Arizona, because so few people even realize that this history is here in Arizona and that there are connections with the Black history of Arizona and southern Arizona, other parts of Arizona. They are all connected. But this history is still here. There are still people here. There are still remnants of this history here. So for instance, so those who may or may not know of Coral Evans, who by the way currently works for Senator Mark Kelly. She's third generation Flagstaff. Her family came in as part of the diaspora. She was in fact mayor of Flagstaff for a period of time. One of the remaining Black schools of downtown Flagstaff is now a community center as part of the Southside Community Center. That mural that you're seeing there in the left, that was actually just put up within the last year, completed with that in the last year. The gentleman standing with a nice little hat in front, that is Dom Flemons. He's third generation Arizonan. His wife is actually third generation Arizonan. He is probably most known as a musician with the Carolina Chocolate Drops and Rihanna Gibbons. But he has a solo career. And by the way, he just played at the MIM in last December. It was excellent. So if you get a chance to see him, please do. But these folks have and are holding on to this history. And Dom is absolutely going through his family and grabbing family history. And there has plans to put that history in with the archives at ASU. So, but it is here. It is absolutely here if you know where to look. And there's more to learn. I also want to point out, because many of us are supporters of Camp Naco, myself included, And thanks, John, who will be talking more about it. But I also want to remind folks that part of that Buffalo Soldier is not only along the border, but there's also a lot of history of Buffalo Soldiers in northern Arizona as also. So this particular display happens to be at Camp Verde. And they do actually celebrate the Buffalo Soldiers in February. So there is still a Buffalo Soldier throughout this history, throughout this state. So I like to remind that there's definitely a connection from Camp Naco through the Buffalo Soldiers throughout the rest of the state as well. All right. Thank you. Any questions?
There are definitely a couple comments and questions, Margaret. I can read a
Can you read
couple
them
of
to
them
me?
out.
Because I can't see
Of
them.
of course. Obviously lots of positivity, but I'll get straight to the meat. All
Okay,
right.
good.
Um, so the first was from Brooks.
Yeah.
Beyond churches, what other social institutions were established specifically for the African American populations in Holbrook, Williams, Flagg, etc.? Are any of them still there?
Thanks for that question. I think he knows part of the answer. The Elks Clubs. There were Black Elks Clubs. And in fact, the Black Elks Club in Flagstaff is still standing and still owned by a Black couple. The Black Elks Club in Winslow, actually, come to find out, it was originally a dance hall. I just found this out. It was called the Arena Hall, and it later became the Black Elks Club. That building is literally imploding as we speak. I don't know if there's an Elks Club in Winslow or in Holbrook. I suspect there may have been some somewhere along the White Mountains. By the way, the church in Pinebrook, no, in Lakeside, the Black church in Lakeside was the original church that was in McNary. So it moved out of McNary into Lakeside. That church, the one in Holbrook, and I believe the one in Winslow, and to some degree the one in Williams, were partially founded through Dom Fleming's family. And one of his grandfather got out and helped to arrange and organize those churches. My guess is there are other social organizations that have no don't have physical remains, but they are probably out there. We just haven't done the work to find out. Oh, I can tell you there is a chapter of the NAACP in Winslow. There's also a chapter of the NAACP in Flagstaff. Next
Thank
question.
you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Jim McPherson suggests that you share with the group two recent initiatives to tell the history of African Americans in Northern Arizona.
Well, yes, Jim, I'd be happy to do that. Actually, there's a couple of them. So, in fact, one of which we're going to hopefully find, which actually involves Camp Naco. Helen Erickson and I put in, and Jim was part of that. Arizona Preservation Foundation absolutely sponsored this. We actually put in a grant, which we hopefully will find out by tomorrow or Saturday whether we got it, to actually do a statewide Black history story map. So we're waiting to hear on that. The other initiative, and Jim, let me make sure I'm getting them all. The other initiative is that a group of us came together through the Arizona Preservation Foundation and State Historic Preservation Office. Jessica Salo out of the Black Archives at ASU, Dr. Anthony Pratcher, and myself, we all worked together to put in a grant application through the African American Action Fund, through the National Trust, National Historic Preservation, Trust for National Historic Preservation. I think I'm blowing that name, sorry. But that we just put that grant in, it's about 2 weeks ago. The whole idea was to focus on Northern Arizona as a starting spot to actually work with students out of NAU to collect oral histories in some of these communities, such as Winslow, Holbrook, Lakeside, and those communities where we still have these remnant Black populations, and hopes to capture some of that history. As well as, especially if we don't get the other grant, doing a story map as part of that, or you can join that information with the other story map we're doing, and hopefully other public presentations around this history. Was there something else, Jim? Did
Got
I,
it.
did
Yeah, I think you got it on that one.
I?
And then
Okay.
there's one more question just added. Uh, that Tom Wright says he's heard stories about the KKK being active in Kingman and Prescott in the 1920s.
Hmm.
Did African Americans face harassment and violence when they resettled in Arizona?
Yes, I'm sure they did. And I can tell you there was a couple of KKK members living at the Grand Canyon. And I'm not going to say who, but there were known characters of the Grand Canyon. Absolutely. Black people certainly were subject to violence and racism out west. I've seen it in my own lifetime. Certainly in California, we had situations where my own parents were staying in the home of a doctor who was getting bombed in flat in just outside of San Bernardino. So yeah, absolutely. But the threat and the amount of it was nowhere near what would have been likely if had you had someone stayed in Mississippi, for instance. So yes, it is something that is it's not, and it comes and goes. Certainly 20s makes sense, especially when you see the economy dies in the 20s and 30s, takes the depression, who gets blamed? So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's one other initiative, and Brooks would probably should slap my hand for forgetting this one, but we are also building what we I think with coalition slash collaboration across the state, where we're bringing in a lot of people, and Camp Naco is absolutely going to be center of this. Um, we're we're bringing a lot of different organizations who are preserving Black history or studying Black folks who are studying and doing things around Black history and art, and as well as oral history and various different aspects of Black Arizona's life experience, and trying to bring a organization where we can all work together and collaborate. That is being built right now. So something that we're hoping to continue to work towards, but we're certainly trying to find ways, because of what's especially because of what's happening in Northern Arizona, where we're absolutely losing these places of historic importance, or we don't know what has that historic importance because we don't really know the history well enough in Northern Arizona to have actually identified it. So we're trying to keep from going the way of Okima. But we certainly have some great examples where Randolph is now on the National Register, and other Camp Naco is also an excellent example of when we people come together and work together, that we can identify and preserve these places. Anything else?
Thank you. That was the last question. I did want to do kind of a last call, see if there's anyone else that would like to share a question for Margaret.
And
Okay.
if anybody's interested in my presentation or anything to do with the presentation, please let me know. I'm happy to share. Um, glad I've become the proselytizer of Northern Arizona Black history, because it's so few people know about it. Somebody's got to get out there and speak for it, and it seems to be that seems to be me. But I'm happy to share whatever I have, what little I have, with anybody who's interested.
And this is being
Well,
recorded too? For
yes,
Yes.
yes.
okay.
Yes, Jim, and if
It'll
you want to put it up on the APF web,
Yeah,
yes,
totally.
we'd be happy to do that.
Totally.
There's another presentation I saw last night on African Americans in Mexico, which was recorded, and I'll get that to you, Jim. It was really good. So hopefully we can get that out to people as well.
Great.
well, thank you very much, Margaret. You have a lot of big fans that you have gained or at least kept after this presentation. So thank you.
Thank
I do
you.
want to also remind folks again that our next program is with John Langelier. He's visiting uh, the Bisbee area for us to have a book signing and a talk at the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum. So I'm going to post the link in the chat for registration. The space is limited for that, and we already have a significant amount of people registered, so better get on there quick. But let's kind of give a round of applause for Margaret. Thank you so much. And
Yay.
if you haven't signed up for our newsletter,